All right, good morning. It's early again. I'm in my pajamas again. Um, but when the inspiration hits to share, I'm going to do that. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how long I've been out of bed. And this morning I do feel the inspiration to continue sharing from the teachings of Inner Ramana, beginning with the very next message in the book, which is on page 23. It's called Looking at the Faults I Thought. And this message starts in a really interesting way. It starts with, it's time to go beyond everything you've learned. For most of us, if not all of us, the spiritual path begins as an intellectual pursuit. In my particular case, A Course in Miracles was the first strong step on the spiritual path, and there was a lot of understanding of metaphysical concepts that was being learned. But I guess the question is, who is learning the metaphysical concepts? A Course in Miracles itself says something about the ego can learn. And that brings back the question, who is learning the metaphysical concepts? And what is awakening? What is the spiritual path all about? Isn't it about letting go of ego? What purpose could there be for ego to learn? The only answer that I come up with is that the purpose for ego learning is that somehow, even within the ego itself, there comes a willingness to let go of ego. It's like, if you read NTI, the Holy Spirit's interpretation of the New Testament, NTI Titus, which I don't have right at my fingertips, so I pull it open and read it. But it says something about even the thinking mind, meaning the ego, will join you in this desire to awaken. It will start being willing to be still, right? So somehow even the ego itself surrenders into this process, or I guess it has to be the ego itself that surrenders into this process, because the true self has never changed. The true self has never wavered. The true self has never left being itself. Therefore, it hasn't fallen asleep, it hasn't developed an ego, and it doesn't have to surrender. So somehow, although it's not totally understandable, all of the learning and even the surrender and even the inquiry process we're going to be learning, that's actually happening to the ego or at the ego level. But there becomes a time when we have to begin to go away from the ego. We have to begin to shift beyond the ego. And since it's the ego that's doing the learning, that means we also have to shift beyond learning. So this particular message begins, it is time to go beyond everything you've learned. Everything you've learned has been helpful. It's been helpful toward willingness to take this next step. But without the step that we are taking together now, all that you've learned serves no real purpose toward awakening. And that again is because the ego has learned it. The ego, whatever type of ego it seemed to be before, whether it was a businessman or a drug addict, it doesn't matter. Now the ego is a spiritual ego. It's smart on metaphysical topics. It can get into debates about, for example, what A Course in Miracles means here or what A Course in Miracles means there. Or, for the Advaita Vedanta folks, it can get into debates, about the who am I question even. But it's still an ego. It's still an ego. So, without taking this next step, it served no real purpose because we haven't actually let go of ego. We've only changed from, I'll call it a worldly ego to a spiritual ego. But ego is still there. First, here we go into taking our next step now. First, we have to notice the false I, and then we must relinquish it by not listening to its chatter anymore. This is the next step we're going to take. It is one thing to tell you that a separate individual I exists in your thinking, and this I is an obstacle to realizing the truth about yourself. It is another thing for you to see and notice this I for yourself. As I've mentioned, we want to get away from the learning, from the intellectual understanding of spiritual and metaphysical concepts, because that, again, is still at the level of ego. And many people have learned about the false I thought. Many people have learned about the inquiry process that Ramana Maharshi taught in his lifetime. And many people can understand these concepts, and many people can debate these concepts, and many people can point out when someone else is listening to their I thought. And sometimes even what appears to be almost an attacking way. And that's because ego understands these concepts, but ego is still being ego with these concepts, with this language now. And we want to move beyond ego. We want to relinquish ego. So we're not looking for an intellectual understanding that we have to let go of the self, or let go of the ego, or let go of the I thought. We want to have an actual experience of noticing this false I within ourselves. And that's where the teachings of Inner Ramana is going to lead us, beyond the intellect to an actual experience, an actual aha, an actual realization. As you look, you will notice that I exists as thought. You will notice that it reinforces itself through the constant chatter of the mind. Every story the mind tells reinforces the concept of me. Every little thought, no matter how subtle, reinforces the individual concept it has of itself. This is probably a good time just to stop. This message continues, but I think if we're going to have the experience that the message is pointing to, we need to stop and we need to take this last paragraph as like an assignment. So I'm going to stop there. And the assignment is to really look, and start noticing how the I thought reinforces the ego sense of self, whatever that ego sense of self is. If the ego sense of self is a fearful self, then start noticing how the I thought, all of the stories that are happening in the mind, are talking about how I is vulnerable. You know, maybe there's financial fears about what's going to happen to my money. What am I going to do when the money runs out? What if I make the wrong investment? What if the stock market crashes next year and I lose my money? Start noticing how the fearful sense of self is reinforced through every single story, every single thought. If it's a spiritual self, if you if you really think that you understand the metaphysical concepts, or that you understand self-inquiry as taught by Ramana Maharshi better than other people do, notice the thoughts around that. Notice the thoughts about I understand. I need to teach other people. I need to get other people to understand. Notice how it's reinforcing I and other. If you have a guilty or an unworthy self, or if you have a responsible sense of self, or a successful sense of self, or a, you're the caretaker self who has to care for family members, just start paying attention. There are so many sense of selves, so many ways the ego can reinforce the idea of this me, this I, right here, the sick person, the sick body. I can't list them all, but why don't you take time now, between now and when I make the next video, to notice your ego sense of self, your idea of me, of I am this and not that. And notice how all of the little stories, all of the little sentences that include I and my and mine are just reinforcing that for you. Things that you're believing right now, reinforcing the idea that you are this, even if it's a spiritual this. All right, and it's time for me to go. So I'll see you when I make the next video. Bye.